Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our panel today entitled People, Not Property, Names, Not Numbers. My name is Dr. Mary Booth, and I am the Program Manager for the Center for the Study of International Slavery. And we are thrilled to partner with the Church of England Racial Justice Unit to host this panel. Before we get started, there's just a few housekeeping details. So this event is being recorded, so we can feature this discussion both on our website and the YouTube page alongside a reading list of supplementary sources that further elaborate on the discussions presented tonight. While we will record the entire event, only the panel presentation will be featured in the recording. The Q&A will not be posted for public consumption following this webinar. If you have any questions that you wish to pose to the panelists throughout the presentations, please submit them via the Q&A tab. Any other questions posted, we won't be able to hear, so make sure they're all posted through Q&A. So without further ado, we will now begin this event with a quick word from Dr. Leona Vaughn, Slavery and Unfree Labor Research Fellow.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Leona Vaughn. I'm the Honorary Fellow for Slavery and Unfree Labor Research at the University of Liverpool. I'm absolutely honoured to have initiated this relationship between the university, including the Centre for Studying International Slavery, and the Church of England's Racial Justice Unit. This seminar series, Truth-Telling Slavery and the Anglican Church, is the first step in this collaboration. It will bring communities, including Anglican communities, together with academics and researchers from all backgrounds to share knowledge, discuss and contribute to the evolving work locally, nationally and internationally to uncover and reckon with the historical role of the Church in African enslavement and develop understanding of the lasting legacies of this violent past for the current day. This inaugural seminar, People Not Property, Names Not Numbers, is timed to mark both the UN International Days for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, today, 21st of March, and the Day of Remembrance of the Victims of Slavery and the Transatlantic Slave Trade on the 25th. This incredible panel of experts, moderated and led by African American Studies Professor Stephen Small of UC Berkeley and author of In the Shadows of the Big House, will set the scene, exploring the relationship between the Anglican Church and slavery in terms of involvement and financial benefit from the enslavement of Africans over centuries. Over to you, Professor Small.
Thank you very much, Leona. I appreciate that introduction. Welcome, everyone. Thank you to the organizers. Thank you to the panelists and to the audience. This is the first webinar of a series organized by the Anglican Church entitled Truth-Telling, Slavery and the Anglican Church. The goal of the series is to explore the historical involvement of the Anglican Church in slavery and its legacies. It's organized as part of the Center for the International Study of Slavery and promoted and supported by the University of Liverpool, who are also producing and hosting the series. Today's webinar is live and recorded and will be placed on the Center for the Study of International Slavery's website in due course. We have 4 presentations of 4 minutes each. We can get right on to introduce our distinguished panelists. I plan to introduce all the panelists at the start. They'll each have 15 minutes to make their presentations, and then we'll have 30 minutes for discussion. Our first panelist is Professor Catherine Hall of University College London. She will be presenting on the Anglican presence in Jamaica in the 18th century through the pro-slavery writings of Edward Long, whose influential history of Jamaica was published in 1774, and John Lindsay, rector of St. Catherine in Spanish Town, the capital of Jamaica. Both of these men were convinced of the essential inferiority of Africans and concerned to influence what they saw as the ill-informed people of England who wanted to abolish the slave trade. Catherine Hall is Emerita Professor of History and Chair of the Centre for the Study of Legacies of British Slavery at University College London. She has written extensively on the history of Britain, gender and empire, including Family Fortunes, co-authored with Leonor Davidoff, Civilizing Subjects, Macaulay and Son, and several others. She's also published Legacies of British Slave Ownership along with her colleagues. From 2009 to 2016, Professor Hall was principal investigator on the project Legacies of British Slavery, and there is a website which provides abundant information, most of it of an unprecedented nature. Her new book project is entitled Lucky Valley, Edward Long and the History of Racial Capitalism, which is published this year. Our second presentation will be by Professor Robert Beckford of Winchester University. In Professor Beckford's presentation, he will argue that truth-telling must begin with addressing how the church or churches became complicit with racial capitalism through the development of what Catherine Gerbner terms Christian slavery. And also, rather than dissipating with time, aspects of Christian slavery echo into the contemporary Christian reparations movement, rendering elements of the fledgling movement neo-colonial in and of themselves. Professor Beckford is the director of Winchester University's Institute for Climate and Social Justice. He is also a professor of Black theology at the Queen's Ecumenical Foundation in Birmingham, and a professor of theology in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies at the VU Free University in Amsterdam. Professor Beckford is a scholar activist specializing in the intersection of theology, race, and resistance in Black religions across the Black Atlantic. Professor Beckford has written 8 monographs in this field, including the recent Decolonizing Contemporary Gospel Music Through Praxis, Handsworth Revolutions, which was published by Bloomsbury in 2023. Professor Beckford also produces knowledge across various media, including television and radio documentaries, drama productions, and contemporary Black music. Our third presentation is by Dr. Rachel Cosgrove, along with Christoph Adamiak from Lambeth Palace Library. Dr. Cosgrove will be presenting on the items in the Lambeth Palace Library collection, items that have been used in the exhibition which took place there in early 2023, which was entitled Enslavement, Voices from the Archives. Dr. Cosgrove is a senior archivist at Lambeth Palace Library, and she leads the team managing the large collections of archives of the Archbishops of Canterbury, as well as other national church institutions and numerous others from the medieval to the modern period relating to ecclesiastical history and to wider topics. Mr. Christoph Adamiak is the archivist managing the extensive archive collections between 1830 and 1990, also at Lambeth Palace Library. And he has led work on material relating to the church and enslavement, including curating the exhibition, Enslavement, Voices from the Archives. And finally, but not least, Dr. Alice Kinghorn from the University of Gloucester. Her presentation outlines the involvement of Anglican missionaries in enslavement during the 19th century in the British Caribbean. Her presentation examines religious teachings and methodologies and the experiences of enslaved people. It then goes on to consider the physical legacies of missionaries and enslavement in British churches. Dr. Kinghorn is a historian of religion and empire. Her research examines the Church of England's involvement in transatlantic slavery through a focus on the work of Anglican missionary societies. Dr. Kinghorn has also been engaged in a number of impact projects and has worked closely with the Diocese of Bristol to research physical legacies of enslavement in Bristol churches. And she is currently a lecturer at the University of Gloucester and consults on contested heritage projects. So a distinguished set of panelists who promise an extremely informative, expansive, and thought-provoking set of presentations and discussions. So we'll begin with Professor Hall. And Professor Hall, please go ahead, and I'll let you know after 10 minutes. Thank you very much. You're currently on mute, yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation to contribute to this webinar on the historic involvement of the Anglican Church in slavery and the lasting implications of colonialism. I'm very pleased to be here today. I'm going to talk briefly about 18th century Jamaica, a slave society, first established as an English colony in 1655, and about Edward Long, the most important historian of the island, an Anglican, a staunch defender of slavery, who's been described as the father of English racism. Long came from a family of slave owners. His great-grandfather, Samuel, was one of the founding fathers of the colony, and he's buried in an impressive black marble tomb with an inscription celebrating his love of justice and his piety in the chancel of St. Catherine's Cathedral in Spanish Town, the then capital of the island. There was no contradiction between being a good Christian and holding men as property. At his death in 1682, Samuel's son, widow, and daughter inherited land and property in enslaved men, women, and their babies to come, and children. The plantations Samuel had established supported the family for generations to come. Edward Long, a third son of the fourth generation of this family, was born in Cornwall in 1734. He went to Jamaica in 1758 in the hopes of making a fortune from his plantation, Lucky Valley. After 11 years on the island, he returned to England in 1769, confident that the production of sugar by the enslaved would provide well for his growing family. On arrival in England, he planned to write a history of the island, but was shocked to discover that the slave trade and slavery were increasingly subject to critical challenges. The famous Somerset trial in 1772 concluded with the Lord Chief Justice, Lord Mansfield, declaring that while slavery was legal in the colonies, which had their own slave laws, there was no such law in England. The slave owners were horrified. The law would no longer protect what they regarded as their property, and law was the bedrock of their security. If the law could not be relied on, then what would guarantee African subjection? Long turned to the black body for an answer. Black bodies, blood, hair, and mind were different from white. Black people and white, he argued, were naturally different, and black people were born to serve. It was not climate that produced difference, as some 18th century Enlightenment figures believed. Rather, he insisted, it was determined from birth. His 3-volume History of Jamaica, published in 1774, which has never been out of print, aimed to convince a metropolitan audience that slavery was natural and essential to the wealth and power of Britain. The Anglican Church was established in Jamaica in 1660 at the restoration of Charles II. Freedom of worship was permitted as long as it was peaceable. The supreme head of the provincial church was the governor, appointed by the Crown. The church was an arm of the state. The Bishop of London claimed Jamaica as in his diocese and licensed the clergy, but beyond that had little effective control. The parish was central to local administration, organized through elected vestries peopled by white men. They were expected to look after the poor, maintain the barracks, so essential to internal and external security, take responsibility for jails and runaways, build markets. In 1759, the population of the island was about 165,000, more than 90% of whom were African, the vast majority enslaved. The clergy had salaries set by law and raised by tithes, which were expected to cover the construction of churches. Residence was required and pluralism forbidden. The churches were white spaces, the sites for birth, marriage, and death for the colonists. It was only with the arrival of the dissenting missionaries from the late 18th century that brought Christian teaching to the enslaved. Slave owners were opposed to the teaching of Christianity, seeing it as potentially dangerous. Long's account of the clergy in the mid-18th century was highly critical. Some, he admitted, were exemplary, but others were lewd and disreputable. Some labourers of the Lord's vineyard, he wrote, have at times been sent who were much better qualified to be retailers of saltfish or boatswains to privateers than ministers of the gospel. His history included descriptions of the parishes, and he was careful to record the existence of churches, even when half-built, and the stipends of their rectors. He hoped that improvements in the character of the clergy and further provision for regular divine worship would improve the morality of the colonists, whose sexual conduct he judged severely. He was strongly opposed to racial mixing and believed in the importance of the purity of white blood. There is no evidence to suggest that Long had a spiritual life or had experienced conversion, which was at the heart of the serious Christianity of the late 18th century evangelicals. He was a nominal Christian, yet convinced that divine providence had created the world, its gendered, classed, and racialized hierarchies. In his mind, the divine fabricator had legitimated slavery by designing all Africans as black, though with gradations of color, marking them off from what he described as the perfection reached in what he called pure white men. Gradations of intellect mirrored those of color. Every member of the creation, he wrote, is wisely fitted and adapted to the certain uses and confined within the certain bounds. Africans filled up that space or degree beyond which they are not destined to pass. This discriminated them from the rest of men, not in kind, but in species. Africans were incapable of a moral sense, and this combined with their black bodies and wool rather than hair defined them, in his mind, as less than fully human. Long depended on assertions to make his case, yet the evidence of his eyes was disturbing. There was a difference between the saltwater slaves, as they were described, who arrived from Africa, and the creolized Negroes who were born on the plantations. This indicated that Negroes, as he called them, could improve, that crossing the Atlantic, as he wanted to believe, was a route to civilization. He never faced the contradiction in his own thinking. How could racial difference both be fixed and yet not fixed? His hope was for a form of benign slavery, one in which there would be no necessity for the whip. In discussing the barbarity of the Code Noir, the laws that governed slavery in the French colonies, he allowed space for his doubts. The bestial inclemency, as he called it, of the French might provoke divine vengeance. If, as some insisted, slavery was in every case an evil, then here in France, in the French colonies, it was the worst of all possible evils. His task, as he saw it in his history, was to demonstrate that colonial slavery, as practiced in Jamaica, was not like that. Long was convinced that the divine being had designed every aspect of the natural world. This included not only all animals and plants, but also earthquakes, lightning, and volcanoes. All were designed so as to naturally balance and create harmony and order. All things are held, he instructed his son, within their allotted bounds by settled invariable laws. Inequality was natural. Weakness must submit to strength, ignorance to knowledge. Otherwise, disorder and anarchy would prevail. The wisdom of the divine mechanism prevailed over all, as the new discoveries of scientists were demonstrating.
5 minutes remaining, Professor Holt.
The hand of providence had almost magically intervened to save a white woman from the hands of the rebels in 1760. Swampy spots in the West Indies had been placed by the divine hand to attract mosquitoes away from those they would otherwise assault. The multiple misfortunes faced by planters must be met with an understanding that nothing befalls us except by the permission or direction of divine providence. Submission to the Father was the proper response. As the immortal poet Pope had written, order is heaven's first law, and this confessed some are and must be greater than the rest. This was also the message of Long's friend, the Reverend John Lindsay, rector of St. Catherine's. Born in Scotland, he served as chaplain to the Navy in the 7 Years' War and was then in Senegal. He arrived in Jamaica at the same time as Long. Both witnessed the major rebellion of the enslaved in 1760, convincing them that the dangers faced by a beleaguered white minority. Over the years, Lindsay became the island's most important Anglican. He married into the plantocracy and became a slave owner himself. He was shocked by the indifference to God's providence amongst the colonists, who only attended church for funerals, and warned of God's vengeance upon them, manifest in slave rebellions and hurricanes. He pondered over the puzzle of the creation of the human race and its strange diversities, and eventually sent his long manuscript to Long. He was appalled by the determination of anti-slavery enthusiasts to set the slaves from Africa at liberty. His 30 years' knowledge of Black people had convinced him to fancy them of a different class of beings, and he hoped to instruct the ill-informed people of England who aimed to ban the slave trade. God's creation was a natural and well-ordered hierarchy. Some men were formed by God to carry heavy burdens. Black skins were to help them to endure. Equality was not part of God's plan. Being enslaved brought redemption, Lindsay maintained, for God had created the peoples of Negro land to serve the superior race. Both Long and Lindsay, aimed to instruct white people in their duties and responsibilities. They were the masters, but must behave as such.
2 minutes remaining, Professor Hall. You have water.
Yeah, I don't have any air. Never mind. I'll survive.
Good,
Long
good.
was disturbed by the increasing numbers of Black people in England in the late 18th century and the dangers of pollution, insisting that white and Black could not coexist. He died in 1813, having campaigned against the abolition of the slave trade, and was buried in pride of place next to the altar in St. Anne's Church in Slindon. He had been living in East Sussex for his final years. His fine memorial was designed by Richard Westmacott, and the inscription celebrated his principles irreproachable, integrity unsullied, love of justice unsurpassed. This was a man who had preserved the universal esteem of his contemporaries. In 2020, the Parish Council unanimously agreed that a plaque with contextual wording should be situated by the memorial. Long's history, it reads, strongly defended slavery as a necessary institution in a plantation economy, and one which contributed much to British wealth and power. Long believed that Black people were essentially different from white people and that they were born to serve. His ideas about racial difference were influential both in the UK and the US. They were challenged by abolitionists at the time and have been ever since by anti-racists. While recognizing the leading role clergy and active members of the Church of England played in securing the abolition of slavery, it is a source of shame that others within the Church actively perpetrated slavery and profited from it. The Church today is committed to support every effort to oppose human trafficking and all other manifestations of slavery across the world. This parish abhors the views of Edward Long and all others who espouse racism in any form. The plaque forms a modest but significant reparatory gesture. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Hall. Excellent timekeeping. As you were speaking, it reminded me that in the 1970s, when I began at university, I read the excellent book, The Sociology of Slavery by Orlando Patterson, who gives us an introduction to Edward Long. And I was also developing my vocabulary. And I remember the description by Patterson of the clergy in Jamaica as being lewd, lascivious, and licentious. And I said, what do all these words mean? And each one was worse than the others. So you brought that to my attention. Thank you very much. Now let's turn to Professor Robert Beckford. And we welcome you, Professor Beckford. Please go ahead. You have 15 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Hall, for that really stimulating introduction. What I want to do is share my screen with you. So if you just bear with me for 2 seconds while I make sure that I get the PowerPoint working here. There we go. Yeah, what I want to do in the 15 minutes or so that I've got is I want to tweak my original proposal and talk about colonial Christian history in the Caribbean as a form of bewitchment and exorcism. So what I'm trying to do here is provide alternative conceptual frameworks for thinking about this history and also its theological dimensions as well. I must say that the motivation for doing this isn't necessarily original. The motivation, as I'll show, comes from reggae music, and I'll be showing some other musical traditions as I go along, because part of my work is about entangling these discourses. So what I'm going to do in the 15 minutes is just talk about the inspiration, method, and theory behind using these tropes. And then I want to talk a little bit about colonial Christianity as a form of bewitchment and exorcism, looking at both the oppressive dimension from the Anglican Church and forms of resistance and re-existence from enslaved Christian and non-Christian communities. And then I want to end by just gesturing towards how this has implications for thinking about the contemporary reparations discourse within the Anglican and other church traditions. As I mentioned before, the inspiration for this comes from reggae music. So I have to start with my hometown favorite reggae band, Steel Pulse. There's a deceptive clue in their song Soldiers from the 1979 album Handsworth Revolution, where they talk about witch doctors and witchcraft. And it's very rare within Rastafari that you have any kind of mention of the old religions from Africa. So I just want to play you 30 seconds of this where Steel Pulse gesture towards witchcraft as a trope for thinking about the slave and colonial history. Oops, hold on, let me get your Steel Pulse. Here we go. You still be you still be nice. All the sun has been. But you didn't try. You left right and center. One moment that we signature. It is all a massacre. God has shield for the guns and center. Prepare for a slaughter. Give up our witch doctor. That's the moment that interests me listening to it 20, 30 years ago. This idea of witch doctor and giving us back the witch doctor. It got me thinking about a method, a way of thinking about the slave and colonial past and the church's involvement within it, using alternative tools. Really helpful in developing a method was James Cone's work, the father of Black liberation theology, and his idea that we should think about faith in context, what he describes as the divine location of the social location of divine revelation, thinking about how social context informs theological ideas. There is obviously an epistemic equivalent to this, the work of Walter Mignola and others in Decoloniality, where they talk about the geopolitics of knowledge. There's a similarity with what Cohn is talking about, and he encourages us, as does Mignola, to think about developing ideas in context and thinking of how these ideas wrestle with the dominant traditions and ways of thinking. So that kind of inspired me then to think about developing a theory of this history by using the work of Charles Long, because Charles Long encourages us to think about the coming of the West. What Professor Hall talked about, Long and other Europeans entering the West Indian space as a form of religious practice, a religious experience, because for Long, colonialism isn't just about economics or politics or even the extraction of resources. It's fundamentally a spiritual activity because it destroyed cosmologies. That idea I further developed by looking at the work of the religionist, the African-American womanist religionist, Diane Stewart, who encourages us to think from the opposite pole of slave religion as forms of expulsion, forms of resistance and re-existence to this spiritual entity that is colonialism and the role of Christianity within it. So what I'm trying to say here is, rather than understanding this history as just economics, politics, or the movement of people, it's fundamentally a spiritual practice. And I'm framing it like a good Pentecostal by thinking about traditions of bewitchment and exorcism. So I just want to take you on that journey in terms of how I get there. In my book, Documentaries Exorcism, which is fundamentally about film studies and theology, I think about the forms of bewitchment as malevolent surplus, the way in which there's an excess of evil within the theological thinking. And then I turn to Pentecostal theology and traditions of post-colonial exorcism to think about exorcisms as forms of expulsion. And I'll get onto that a little bit later on. So bewitchment then is this surplus of evil, and then the resistance to it, thinking about exorcism as a form of expulsion, expelling the evil from the body. And if you know anything about New Testament exorcism, you know that that works in terms of the exorcisms of Jesus, but we'll get onto that a little bit later. So when we're talking about this history as a surplus of evil, there are two really important stop-off points. One is the doctrine of discovery, which is the church's attempt to rationalize the brutalization, invasion, and enslavement of indigenous people and the trafficking and enslavement of African people. Then there's the construction of what they term Christian slavery. It's the work of Catherine Gerbner. Christian slavery is the church's, the Anglican Church's legitimation of slavery, its collusion with the surplus of evil. And these ideas are confirmed, I argue, within slave narratives. There are very few slave narratives from the West Indies, but the two major ones confirm this idea that slavery isn't just economic or physical, it's a spiritual practice. And they use language that emerges from West African witchcraft thinking to describe their predicaments. I just want to take you through the bewitchment then very quickly and then get on to the exorcism, because I know I've only got 15 minutes and we're all trained in academia to work in 50-minute blocks and then take a 10-minute break. So I'm going to try and be as quickly as I can. Look, doctrine of discovery has three really important drop-off points. Three papal bulls. The first, Dom Diversas, basically gives King Alfonso V of Portugal the right to invade, subjugate and consume non-Christian lands, peoples, and resources. It's the church legitimating this form of colonization, extraction, and brutalization of people. We then know that a little bit later on, that there's an elaboration on this, which allows Portugal then to invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue. Although this is fundamentally about dealing in part with the Islamic threat, the Saracens, it's applied also to the New World. And this language is really, really kind of significant, you know, and also to have dominion, possessions, and all movable and immovable goods whatsoever held in and possessed by them, and to reduce their person to perpetual slavery, and to apply and appropriate to himself and his successors, the kingdom, dukedoms, countries, principalities, dominions, possessions, and goods. Again, this idea that you can then just take this stuff because there's nobody there, the people there, the lands there are absent, and therefore the church legitimates this practice. The final one, which is after the Columbus stumbling upon what becomes known as the West Indies, the Caribbean, then dividing this world that they've discovered between France and Portugal. Now, I want to think about this not in terms of a political act, although it has political ramifications well into the 20th century, but I want to think about this as the spiritual practice, how the church then colludes with a set of ideas that we may consider to be evil, repugnant, and malevolent, this surplus of evil. It's no wonder that this doctrine was repudiated by the Pope not so long ago. The second area where I think we get another sense of the spiritual practice, bewitchment, the entanglement of Christianity with this surplus of evil, is in the concept of Christian slavery. It's an idea developed by the historian Catherine Gerbner, where she argues that Morgan Godwin, the 17th century Anglican missionary to the Americas and Barbados, in his writing tries to compromise with plantation life and introduces this idea of reforming slavery by producing good Christian slaves, what she calls Christian slavery. And the idea here is basically that if the slaves are taught a particular form of the gospel, one that's quite passive, it will improve them as enslaved people, and it will ensure that there will be no insurrection. So it's a win-win for the enslavers, for the Christianized colonizers. They are therefore able to get docile, productive slaves, but also present themselves as perpetuating the Christian gospel and evangelizing to the enslaved. But the kind of gospel that they produce is really quite interesting. There's an interesting illustration that we can use to show how Christian slavery works on the plantations. Count Ludwig von Zinzendorf, the patriarch of the Moravian tradition, in his visit to the West Indies, we have an excerpt of one of his sermons, which I think is instructive for how this Christian slavery is supposed to work. He informs them they've got to be true to their husbands and wives and obedient to their masters. Nothing wrong with that. That works in terms of what was happening in Europe in terms of social hierarchy and the church's involvement within it. But then he gets into this idea of folding the gospel into the new racial hierarchy. The Lord has made all ranks, kings, masters, servants, and slaves. God has punished the first Negroes, he says, by making them slaves, and your conversion will make you free, not from the control of your masters, from your wicked habits and thoughts, and all that makes you unhappy with your lot. Is that my 10-minute marker?
You have 5 minutes left.
5 minutes.
Professor Beckford.
Thank you. So the second jump-off point for me here is with Christian slavery, where the church colludes with the enslavement and brutalization of black flesh and constructs a gospel that folds the gospel into racial hierarchy, folds it into hermeneutics, the whole idea of the curse of Ham narrative, and folds it into a negative black ontology, the idea that these Africans, these bodies are pathological, collusion with it. The interesting thing for me is that there's been very little intellectual reflection on this from the Church of England. In the last 100 years, only 2 books published in the 1980s, 1990s have dared to engage with this issue. More recently, there's been an attempt to look at whiteness in theological education, but not wrestle theologically with this issue. The second jump-off point for this bewitching by the church, I'm arguing, is Christian slavery. I'm going to move as quickly as I can now. So look, how do we know that there is some validation, there's some validity in this idea from the enslaved themselves? Well, read again Equiano, read Mary Prince, where they talk about their captivity using witchcraft language, the idea of consumption and illicit consumption. In Olade Equiano's work, he talks about the fear of being eaten when he first encounters the white men, and then later on the plantation, using the idea of consumption to describe the process. Mary Prince, likewise, when she's going to market for the first time to be sold, she uses the language of food, of being consumed by this institution. And what I'm suggesting here is that if Mimi Scheller is correct, and the language of consumption is very much a form of African resistance, religious resistance or interpretation, a diagnostic of the situation, then these enslaved narratives are also gesturing towards the fact that this process is a spiritual practice, a form of wickedness, of bewitchment. What's the opposite then? Well, there is the resistance to this, which is exorcism. If I had time, I'd share a little clip of the exorcism from Martin Scorsese's film, just to think about how we understand this process. But the resistance to this, I argue then, is it should be framed as exorcism. And in the New Testament, post-colonial biblical interpreters tell us that Jesus's exorcisms are best understood as signifiers of how to drive the Romans out of the body of Israel. They're really anti-colonial themes. If we take that on board, then it's possible to read the resistance of enslaved Africans, the rebellions, Taki's rebellion, the Sam Sharp rebellion of 1831, as forms of exorcism, expelling the oppressor out of the land. Now, why does this matter today? Why does it matter to think about it this way? Well, partly because we need language. We need new language to frame how we understand this history. And what I'm suggesting is that we understand it as a negotiation of a malevolent surplus, of the bewitchment. We need then a way of thinking about our activity today in terms of reparations as a form of exorcism. And what I'm suggesting for the Anglican Church is that while there's some discussion about whiteness and seeing whiteness in Christian theology as being problematic and anti-blackness as well, how do we conceive of that process as a form of expulsion, of expelling the oppressor out of theological education? And then how do we memorialize this process of exorcism? What kind of liturgies, what kind of monuments are necessary to demonstrate and remind ourselves of that expulsion? And what I'm suggesting ultimately is this is a useful route for thinking about reconciliation. Slave and colonial history and the church's involvement within it as a form of bewitchment, and our resistance to that, our overcoming of it today in the tradition of the enslaved as forms of exorcism. Thank you.
Hey, wonderful. Thank you very much, Professor Beckford. A powerful set of insights into the dynamics of religious philosophy and practices, and into the need, as I see it, for an alternative conceptual framework so necessary for decolonizing knowledge, going back to the roots and rejecting some of the fundamental principles of Western knowledge and Western writers. It also reminded me very personally and professionally of the profound importance of reggae music as a counter-epistemology, growing up in the 70s, in a time when we were all suffering from what we now call colonized knowledge, and our children and fellows were being designated by the British state as educationally subnormal. I remember Steel Pulse in particular, and many others. Thank you very much for that presentation. Okay, our next presenter is Dr. Rachel Cosgrove and Mr. Christoph Ademiak. Please go ahead, Dr. Cosgrove. You have 15 minutes.
Great, thank you. Bear with me for one moment while I attempt to share my screen and get my presentation going. Hang on one moment. Oh, sorry. So you may have to live with it like that. So I can't get it to start going on properly, but I will start anyway, not to waste time. Yeah, I'm Rachel Cosgrave, Senior Archivist at Lambeth Palace Library. A very brief introduction to the library to give you a bit of context. It was founded in 1610, but we're in a new building, as you can see from this slide, opened in 2021, funded by the Church Commissioners, combining the collections of the old library at Lambeth Palace and the former Church of England Record Centre. A large collection, some 20,000 linear metres of shelving for our collections, both archives and printed, a reading room which is available to researchers, and other public facilities, including exhibition space. A couple of brief provisos. I don't claim to be an expert on the history of enslavement. I can only try to represent something of our collections in this area, which I hope acts as an invitation to anyone interested to explore further. And involvement in this work in this topic has very much been a learning process for me. Also to acknowledge that a lot of the language that our collection uses is historic, not current. And some of the material, of course, we realise is disturbing or painful. One example, the word, I quote, Negro appears ubiquitously in our records, and I will refer to it, which of course I use in its historical usage and understand is not a current term. Also, another bit of brief context to this sort of work, which is that in 2019, the Church Commission has initiated research into historic links to African chattel enslavement. This involved research into the historic records of Queen Anne's Bounty, which is one of the Church Commissioner's predecessor bodies, founded in 1704 to augment the incomes of poorer clergy. And in 2023, a report based on this research was published about the work. And this uses one of the library's core archive collections, the archive of Queen Anne's Bounty. And in very brief terms, there was evidence of connections between this fund with enslavement, firstly in connection with investment in the South Sea Company, and secondly, evidence of individual benefactors to the fund, of whom a notable example was Edward Colston, a well-known name. You can see his name in an example from our records here. Of course, the slave trader whose statue was pushed into Bristol Harbour in 2020. So evidence of these links. Much more could be said on this, but I don't want to speak to that, but really to focus a bit on material in the library collections which relate to these topics. In connection with the publication of a report in early 2023, the library put on an exhibition about its collections in the area, and so I really want to focus on a few items from that. The Queen Anne's Bounty records I mentioned are financial records, I suppose in a sense quite dry records, and it was quite a technical exercise to analyse those to come up with these outputs about the connections between the predecessor of the Commissioner's Fund and these areas. But some of the items in our collections, I think, speak in a way more powerfully of the connections. So one example here, and these really speak to the theme here of the conception of enslaved people as property. So this is quite a well-known image. I think it's not unique to our collection, and it's the diagram of the ship Brooks that transported enslaved people sort of in the late 18th century. Illustrating, of course, the horrors of the journey across the Atlantic, and it was widely copied and distributed by abolitionists in the late 18th century onwards. Around 490 people at least were believed to have been kept on board the ship in crowded conditions for several months. So sort of emblematic of the suffering that they endured. My next slide is an expression of income and expenditure for the Codrington plantation in Barbados between 1737 and 1743. This is from a collection relating to the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts, SPG, which founded in 1701 aimed to expand the role of the Anglican Church across the British Empire. A bequest to establish a theological college in Barbados made the SPG owners of a sugar plantation which ran on the labour of enslaved people. And notes at the bottom right-hand side of this sheet mention that 69 Negroes, as it says, purchased within these 7 years cost nearly £2,000. So again, sort of powerful representation of this conception of people as property. A very brief note here, we have some records relating to SPG, but the main archive is actually held elsewhere, a frequent source of confusion, but it's really one part of the sort of archival documentation of that organisation. Moving on, we have here another item from our collection, and this is a printed listing of the slave population in the West India colonies, and this dates from 1823. The list prepared by the authorities of the island of Jamaica was in response to a request from the House of Commons, and it provides us now with some names of some enslaved individuals and a small part of their stories. This one preserved in the papers of the Christian Faith Society. This originated in 1691, was renamed in 1794 the Society for the Conversion and Religious Education of the Negro Slaves in the British West India Islands. So again, we sort of now get some sort of evidence of named individuals who were enslaved. My next item, which featured in the exhibition I mentioned that we held here in the library, is an anonymous petition which is addressed, as it terms it, to the Lord Archbishop of London, dates from 1723. This letter, sent from Virginia, is one of the earliest known pleas for freedom by an enslaved person. This unusual document was created in secrecy over a period of a month, probably using homemade ink, and it asks for the freedom of specifically mixed race enslaved people, and also provides an account of the abusive practices at a plantation. The writer tells us that they are but a poor slave and reveals that they are owned by their own brother. The writer's main appeal for emancipation is then followed by a plea for Christian education. I think there's some conception that becoming literate and becoming Christian were seen by some as acts that undermined the system of enslavement. This item forms part of the papers of the bishops of London, who at this period had jurisdiction over America and the Caribbean. And this item in particular, we felt proved particularly powerfully resonant of the experience of an individual and the voice of an individual, albeit unfortunately unnamed, which really seemed to speak to the people, or some of the people that attended our exhibition. So this sort of seems like a really powerful exhibit that was included there. Another item, again, documenting the story of an individual, is this letter which we included in the exhibition. And this is, again, a petition from a woman named Esther Smith. And her story was that she tried to obtain baptism at St. Alphegus Church in Greenwich in London, and sought to avoid being sent to the West Indies. It includes letters also from the church's vicar, Samuel Squire. There's a small chronology of correspondence between different people discussing her case and the issues. And her enslaver opposed her baptism. And really, the items sort of speak powerfully of her desperation and her fears about what's going to happen to her. This letter forms part of the papers of Thomas Secker, who was Archbishop of Canterbury between 1758 and 1768. Archbishop Secker eventually sought advice from Philip York, first Earl of Hardwicke, who confirmed that a slave brought to England is still a slave, and that baptism would not change this status. And this one was a few years before the Mansfield ruling in the Court of King's Bench in 1772, which related to the right of an enslaved person on English soil not to be forcibly removed from their country and sent for sale. So sort of, I suppose, forms part of that discourse around that period. Another item, again, sort of speaks to an individual story. Again, a woman. This item relates to a woman named Betty Cudjoe. And the letter is really objecting to the proposed marriage of Betty Cudjoe, who was an enslaved woman, to William Harris, who was a free man. It was written by the attorneys of the owners of the plantation to the rector of the parish of St. Anthony in Montserrat. And her enslavers decided to take action when it was discovered that Betty was planning to marry William. The parish rector, Benjamin Luckock, was in favour of the marriage, and the first bans had already been published. The attorneys demanded that Luckock should not publish any further bans on the grounds that such a marriage would affect the economy of the estate that claimed to own Betty, and that it would in general destroy the rights of the supposed lawful owners of enslaved people. And again, this letter is contained in papers of William Hooley, who was Bishop of London between 1818 and 1828. So those are a few items from our archive collections, which speak to the experiences of individual enslaved people. And now an item from our printed book collections. And this is, again, it's not unique to our collection, I suppose quite a well-known portrait perhaps, but our copy of the autobiography of Oludare Equiano, who was born in what is now Nigeria and enslaved into the New World, but later resided in England, where he, of course, became part of the campaign against the slave trade. And this portrait of him on the left forms part of the frontispiece of the book. On the right-hand side, an engraving from the second volume of the work shows the shipwreck of the Nancy, a vessel upon which he worked in the Caribbean, and again serves an example of one of the many harrowing episodes he would survive and eventually write about. And finally...
Yes. 5 minutes remaining, Dr. Cosgrove.
Great, got it, thank you. The further item that I wanted to speak about, again, obviously from our printed book collections, and again, not entirely unique to our collections, but again, I think it was one of the items in our exhibition that provoked particular interest. And this is a volume that was published on behalf of the Society for the Conversion of Negro Slaves, which I've already mentioned. This version was published the year after the trade in enslaved people was abolished in 1808. I think its power as an exhibit really lies in its size. Whereas a standard Protestant Bible contains about 1,200 chapters, this version contains only 232, and it excludes something like 90% of the Old Testament and some perhaps 50% of the New Testament. And the reason it does this is that it excludes many references to freedom and escape from slavery, which were removed from the text in this edition. So, for instance, the text skips directly from Genesis to Exodus 19, includes the 10 Commandments, but the first 18 books of Exodus, in which the Israelites escaped slavery in Egypt, have been removed. So that just gives quite rather a gallop through some of our material, which is much more extensive in this area. And I've just put our website on here, and so hopefully that's a gateway to anyone who would like to explore these topics further. And I believe some links have also been included in the reading list that is associated with this presentation. The library's collections are freely available to registered readers, hopefully a straightforward process if anyone wants to come and look at the material, and you can look at what you need to do to get a reader's ticket on our website. And various other kind of resources that you can access if you're interested in. The Church Commissioner's reports into links with African chattel enslavement is available online. Two particular things to note in connection with what I've talked about is two of the items I've talked about, the letter from the unnamed enslaved person and also the material relating to Esther Smith. And there are actually recordings, audio recordings of some of those items, which do hopefully give you quite a powerful sense of those items from our archive. And we've also produced a research guide on this topic and on broader global majority heritage sources, which are within our collections, which again is hopefully an invitation to people who might be interested in exploring that further. And just to acknowledge my colleague, Krista Damiak, who is actually the person who curated our exhibition on this and also wrote this presentation and has really led our work in this area, and who will also be on the Q&A panel for this webinar. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Cosgrove, and to your colleague also. Fascinating introduction and a strong notification and reminder that there is an abundance of resources, contemporaneous resources available. And one of my questions was whether these resources are accessible. And you spoke to that in terms of things being available online. So as you know, since the violent murder of George Floyd, there's been a dramatically increased interest in a wide range of issues to do with slavery and its legacies, including around religion. And it's reassuring to know that these materials are available and accessible. And we expect to see very substantial research and insights being provided in years to come. Thank you very much for finishing on time, actually way ahead of time. I appreciate it. Okay,
Can I then
our final speaker.
jump in to say that not all, inevitably, the body of material is sufficiently large that by no means all of it is digitized, but it is hopefully accessible via our catalogues and, you know, as I say, through the reading room. So, you know, it can't all be digital, but we hope to sort of surface what is available.
Also,
we know you are doing the best that you can with the limited resources that you have, and we appreciate it. So thank you to you both. Our final speaker is Dr. Alice Kinghorn. Please go ahead. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly.
You are. Just give me 1 second. Someone is trying to come into my locked room. One second.
Everyone can take a deep breath. Start preparing your questions. I have some great questions. I'm never short on questions, me. I have a lot of practice. So, but I want to encourage the audience to submit questions through the Q&A or be ready to submit questions so that we can get a lively discussion going. We certainly have time.
Thank
you. Are you ready, Alice?
Yeah, sorry about
please,
that. What
Dr.
bad
Kinghorn.
timing.
No worries, no worries. Please go ahead. I'll start you now.
Let me just share my screen. Can you see that okay? Yeah.
I can see it okay,
yeah.
Yes.
Fab. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm sorry about the little interruption there. Today I've been asked to share some aspects of my PhD research, which focused on Anglican missionaries in the early 19th century Caribbean. And then at the end to give a brief overview of a pilot project surrounding contested heritage that I ran with the Diocese of Bristol. My PhD focused on the work of an Anglican missionary society that Dr. Cosgrave introduced, known as the Conversion Society or the Incorporated Society. It was formed by the Bishop of London, Bilby Porteous, in 1794. And the Society's mission was to convert and instruct enslaved people in the Caribbean in the Anglican Church and teachings. The Society's peak came following the introduction of resolutions calling for the amelioration of slavery, introduced in 1823 by Britain's Foreign Secretary George Canning. By balancing, according to Canning, quote, the well-being of the slaves themselves with the safety of the colonies, Canning kept the supporters of slavery on side by not advocating for emancipation. And calls for religious instruction for enslaved people, specifically under the Church of England, underlay arguments for amelioration in this period, as it was seen as a means to foster this so-called, quote, improvement. As Professor Beckford noted, the idea that in order to be improved, enslaved people needed to be, quote, civilized, and to be civilized, enslaved people had to be Christianized. This was a moral justification using the Church of England. And subsequently, the Conversion Society increased the number of missionaries working for them. Most of what we know about the Conversion Society comes from missionaries stationed in the Caribbean who kept journals and wrote letters updating the Society's secretaries of their mission's progress, and most of these are held in Lambeth Palace Library. But this information was then collected, curated, and compiled to form the annual report for the Society, printed in London. These reports were then sent to subscribers to report on news and successes. Due to the Society's wider purpose to provide religious instruction to the so-called uncivilized, missionary writings conveyed a very specific writing style. Missionaries focused on positive achievements, particularly in the context of conversions, and the annual reports promoted this narrative, primarily relying on numbers that stripped enslaved people of their identities in these texts. The Society cared about how many enslaved people missionaries had taught, baptized, converted, married, how many people attended church, how many of these were men, women, and children, what chapels had the highest attendance, and how many churches and chapels had been built. Enslaved people were very rarely named in the missionary writings of the Conversion Society, and missionary archives project the stories of enslaved people who contributed to their mission. Thus, those who were named had typically been converted and baptized or married in the Church of England, particularly if missionaries wanted to tell a story of a, quote, special or blessed enslaved person. And hence the names and experiences of enslaved people visible in histories of Anglican instruction are shaped by the perceived esteem of participations in missionary endeavours. The selection of enslaved people's experiences that missionaries chose to include is seen in the inclusion of a conversion story of an enslaved woman named Lucinda in the Conversion Society's 1829 annual report. Lucinda is one of only a handful of enslaved people explicitly named across 15 years of printed reports. According to the report, produced by the rector of St. Lucy in Barbados, Lucinda was a young enslaved woman and had lived and worked in Bridgetown. However, after falling ill, she worked as a, quote, common field labourer on her enslaver's property, John Gill's. In November 1828, the rector had heard, quote, a slave of the most respectable character, referring to Lucinda, who wished to be baptized before her death. Lucinda had, quote, qualified herself for baptism by learning the Lord's Prayer, the Belief, and the 10 Commandments. Lucinda continued to attend church and, quote, a white girl, a day scholar from the parochial school for whites, came and taught her orally, for she knew not one letter of the alphabet for the church catechism. Lucinda was admitted for the Holy Communion and continued to attend church until she was no longer able to, and so the rector asked for permission from the manager to visit her. We can see that by looking at baptism records that on the 9th of November 1828, Lucinda was baptized by William Marshall Hart. Lucinda died soon after being baptized. She was buried in September 1829, aged 19, listed as residing at John Gill's in Durham, St. Lucie. And William Marshall Hart also performed the burial ceremony. Lucinda's story was a demonstration of pure piety and conversion, described by the rector as an example, quote, of religious improvement and pious behaviour that was seen as so interesting in nature. It demonstrated a dedication to the faith through Lucinda's strength to continue to learn and pray even whilst gravely ill, a common trope and figure of the missionary narrative. The assistance of the white day scholar reinforced racial associations with missionaries as civilizers through providing religious instruction. And so Lucinda's story proved the success of missionary work to subscribers. Cases of enslaved people being named in missionary writings from the Conversion Society are incredibly rare. As we've seen, missionary societies worked with numbers, constantly trying to improve the metrics of their endeavours. The metric's purpose was to try and encourage donations and support. So it's important to consider, how was the society funded? Who did it owe its allegiances to? The Conversion Society relied on support from subscribers. And following Canning's 1823 amelioration resolutions, the society saw a stark increase in popularity, particularly from enslavers. The Standing Committee of the West India Planters and Merchants of the City of London resolved that an Anglican extension of the means of religious instruction was necessary. The committee had already noticed and praised the Conversion Society's work, and subsequently they offered £1,000 to the society, accompanied by £100 from associations in Liverpool and Glasgow. And so the Conversion Society then began to stress the need for support from resident enslavers and the West India interest. The Society's 1823 report stated, where the right of the master over the services of the slave is absolute, it is next to impossible to attempt the work of conversion on the latter without the aid of the former. And then the Conversion Society went on to promote itself at colonial associations in order to collect subscriptions and donations. This was successful, and by 1824, the Society's governors included a number of prominent planters. Their support led to the, quote, satisfaction that the Society had the support of the highest rank in both church and state, as well as by several of the most considerable of the West India proprietors. An analysis of subscribers and donors to the Society in 1824 demonstrates that their 1823 fundraising efforts were successful. By cross-referencing annual subscribers and one-time donors to the Society with UCL's Legacies of British Slavery database, we can discern the connections here. Half of all donors to the Society in this year appear in the database. 42 were merchants and 84 were enslavers. And so these donations suggest a codependent relationship between these individuals and the Society. In other words, donors had faith that the Society would not, quote, corrupt the minds of enslaved people on the basis that the Society would only teach Church of England material. And simultaneously, the Society had a duty to do so because of their immense reliance on the financial aid that these donors provided. Because then the Society had a duty to only provide religious instruction that would be endorsed by their financial supporters, the material used by the Society had to be highly censored and structured. As we've seen in the story of Lucinda, she learnt the Lord's Prayer, the Belief, and the 10 Commandments, and then sought to learn to read to learn the Catechism. And missionaries sent requests for approved teaching material to the Society Secretary in London, And when we look at the type of material that missionaries requested, this included Bibles, child's first books, Hart's lectures, the catechism, and spelling books.
You have 5 minutes remaining.
Thank you. And I'm just going to touch on one of these today. First published in 1822, Hart's lectures were frequently sent to the Conversion Society missionaries. Christopher Lipscomb, the Bishop of Jamaica, received 50 copies. They were written by William Marshall Hart, one of the Society's clergymen stationed in Barbados, the same Hart who had baptized Lucinda. Hart aligned himself with the prejudice and racism of enslavers, for example, preaching about the, quote, acknowledged vices of the enslaved, which he assured enslavers was, quote, the acknowledged tendency of Christianity to correct. Hart also urged enslaved people to be grateful for their position. He wrote, God has been pleased to place you in an inferior situation in life, and it is your duty to behave as becomes persons in that situation. However fatiguing it may sometimes be to your bodies, take my word for it that you have reason to thank your Heavenly Father for giving you so much employment and work, that you have no time for listening to the temptations of the devil. Here, Hart is clearly supporting the status quo of slavery. This and other material used by the Conversion Society had to be approved by their financial supporters, enslavers, and the church. The Conversion Society navigated how to get more donations, firstly by focusing on numeric details of missionary work. It was the numbers that were important, and enslaved people therefore are rarely included by name. Secondly, the material used by the Conversion Society was heavily censored. This ensured an ongoing support from the plantocracy and the West India interest. And finally, I'm just going to touch on the physical legacies of this in churches today. A number of enslavers, many of whom made up the numbers of donors, had elaborate memorials in churches, particularly in Britain's slave imports, but also in some rural areas around the cities. For example, Thomas Daniel, one of the largest donors to the Conversion Society, has a memorial in Bristol Cathedral. Beyond this, churches in Bristol have done some great work addressing contested heritage. For example, St Mary Redcliffe in Bristol recently removed and replaced 4 window panels dedicated to Edward Colston with 4 contemporary stained glass windows. The design was chosen after a competition was launched in 2021, and the new panels depict Jesus, quote, in multiple ethnicities to counter the Anglo-centric narrative of white Jesus, and they were designed by local Dr. Eilish Swift. However, many churches in Bristol are interested in beginning to address contested heritage in their buildings. I ran a partnership project between the University of Bristol and the Diocese of Bristol in the spring of 2023, and this project researched contested heritage objects in select churches, primarily memorials. The context emerged from the pledge from the church in 2020 to review statues and memorials. However, most parishes lack the researchers and/or funds to do this research themselves. Participation in this project was completely voluntary. I left this up to PCCs, and I held initial information meetings where I invited church representatives and parishioners to attend to find out more about the project. This gave opportunity to feedback and collaborate on initial phases of the project. If churches decided to take part, I worked with them to examine and photograph any memorials or other physical legacies connected to transatlantic slavery. There was also the opportunity to share existing lines of inquiry here. At the end of the project, all participating churches were invited to a discussion group to consider the lessons learned and answer any further questions. A large number of memorials with contested heritage were found, and each participating church has received an individual report with photographed and transcribed memorials. From this project, I've learnt the importance of transparency, discussion, and collaboration. The importance of community-led initiatives, particularly from an academic researcher's perspective, means that work such as this is not one that should be done by academics and academics alone. Church members of local communities, especially those affected by systemic racism and inequality, need to be at the heart of this at every stage of the process. By ensuring that they're at the centre of this research, it can lead to an open and transparent process. Overall, I hope this presentation has given some insight into the work of Anglican missionaries, how the metrics and publications of missionaries in the Church of England have resulted in a focus on numbers rather than the lives of enslaved people, and just a brief insight into how the legacies of this physically in Britain's churches are pronounced and how this can begin to be addressed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Kinghorn. Okay.